Please stand now as you are able in honor of Jesus' words as they come to us today in the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day to be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. You know, I love my ranch. For those of you who don't know, 10 years ago, my wife and I bought 52 acres south of Rock Spring, Texas, using some money we inherited from my wife's grandmother. Now, some of you might look at that place and go, "That's just a bunch of rock, dirt, and prickly plants that try to reach out and grab you and hurt you at every chance they get." And you would be right. But to me, it's a little piece of heaven. It's a place of peace and quiet that we have worked on and put our stamp on over time. Whenever I spend out there, both my mind and body relax as I get to disconnect from all of the chaos in the world. And during the COVID shutdowns, it was a place of refuge and retreat so that my family and I could get out of the house. And my wife, Donna, will tell you that on multiple occasions, I have said, "I need about a month out at the ranch." And I've never gotten that month. In fact, I don't even think I've gotten a straight week to spend out there. These days, I'm lucky to only get a few hours to do a little bit of work and fill the deer feeders. I haven't been able to spend the night out there since last hunting season. Why? Well, because there are things that always pop up on the calendar. The kids have engagements that I, as a parent, need to get to. There are church events that get scheduled, which are very important for me to attend. Moms need some time with their kids and their grandkids. Unexpected and unanticipated conflicts arise requiring my attention. I never seem to get to do what I want to do. Does anyone else ever feel that way? I didn't think I was the only one. I think many of us would like to have control over our lives, to be able to do what we want to do, to engage in the activities that we want to engage in, and to have no responsibility towards anyone or anything except for ourselves. And one would believe that living such a life would make a person exceedingly happy. And in fact, there are more than a few people who actually take this approach. They live for themselves, and they expect everyone else to make way for them and for their pleasure. But there are multiple problems with this, not the least of them being that we are not the center of the universe. The world does not revolve around us and our wants and our needs and desires. And then, in fact, when too many people try to make everything about themselves, the very fabric of society begins to crumble. Traditions and values get lost, cultures disappear. And if you think what I am describing now is part of what is going on currently in the U.S. and even right here in Fredericksburg, you'd be right. For there is a very pervasive thought within our culture that places the self above everything else. There's a very pervasive thought which says that self-affirmation, self-identification, and self-determination are to trump everything else around. So instead of acclimating to the cultures, values, and traditions of a given organization, town, or country, it is expected that the organization, town, or country will accommodate a self. And instead of learning the cultures, values, and traditions of an organization, town, or country, those entities are expected to bend over backwards and change to accommodate someone from the outside. And again, when an unhealthy love of self and an inflated sense of self-importance take over, then we become a stumbling block to a healthy organization, community, or even nation. Our gospel lesson teaches this very thing today, and it also gives us the cure. So let's delve into this passage from the 16th chapter of the book of Matthew. But before I do so, let me set the stage, because this text follows right upon the heels of our gospel text last week that Grizz preached on. And if you didn't get that reference, go back and watch the YouTube video of last week's sermon, or go look at our office doors. But in that text last week, Peter, Jesus' disciple, he made an eye-popping assertion that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus affirmed Peter's declaration and gave him a nickname, called him the Rock. And then he said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." So our gospel lesson this week picks up right after that, and it picks up with a startling twist. Matthew tells us that from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, be killed, and then on the third day to be raised. And I say that this text is startling because no one would have expected Jesus to say that. And I mean that. No one would have expected that. There is no Jewish thought, writing, or anything from that time period or before that would suggest that the Messiah would go to Jerusalem to suffer at the hands of the Jewish authorities, to be killed, and to rise. That just wasn't the idea about the Messiah at all. It was very, very different. In fact, everyone would have expected Jesus to say, "Now it's time for me to head to Jerusalem to cast down Caesar's armies, and I will cleanse the temple and the Jewish faith. I will ascend to the throne and usher in God's kingdom, and I will bring peace and justice to the world." See, that's what the Messiah was supposed to say. That's what all the Jewish faithful taught. That's what the parents would tell their children of the stories of the faith at bedtime. That's what they would discuss in the synagogues. That's what fueled their dreams whenever the tax collector came around or when Roman soldiers abused men, women, or children. One day, they thought, one day the Messiah will come and remove all of this and establish us in our right place. That's what Jesus should have said. Not, "I'm going to Jerusalem to suffer, die, and be raised." And so good old Peter. Peter comes along and he takes Jesus aside. And you can almost picture Peter putting his arm around Jesus at this moment, this big burly fisherman who believed he knew better. This big burly fisherman who was now full of himself since Jesus told him previously that God had given him a special revelation. This big burly fisherman who took it upon himself to correct his teacher. That was an unheard of thing in the rabbinic tradition. You just didn't do that. But again, he was full of himself. And so he tells Jesus, "Hey, mercifulness be upon you. May such a thing never happen." That's probably a more accurate Greek translation instead of the one that I read, but the sentiment is exactly the same. Essentially, Jesus, this isn't the way it's supposed to go. We all know that. So stop talking nonsense. And of course, Jesus responds. And one might consider Jesus' response to be a bit over the top. It would almost seem like the tongue lashing that Jesus gives is disproportionate to Peter's comment and intent. Get behind me, Satan. For you are a stumbling block to me. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. From a rock to a stumbling block. How quickly things change. But that's kind of part of human nature, you know. Because, how many times has that kind of happened to us? How many times have we done something that we have received kudos for, that we've received pats on the back for, and tons of affirmation, only then within a few hours, few days, we've done or said something that just brings us crashing back down to earth. You see, there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. And Peter crossed the line. His arrogance and self-centeredness led him to think that he was better than his teacher. And his teacher put him back in his place, saying, hey, Peter, when you follow me, you're a rock. But when you get in front of me, you're a stumbling block. And not only that, you're Satan. You are opposing God and the things of God. And again, we might consider that to be pretty harsh. But as some scholars suggested, Jesus is likely hearkening back to his time in the wilderness after his baptism, after he spent 40 days and nights fasting in that wilderness, because after those 40 days and nights, Satan came to him and tempted him. And Satan offered him power and prestige and wealth, saying, if you bow down to me, I'll give you the world. And now Peter is trying to get Jesus to seize the worldly power that belongs to the Messiah. The temptations are exactly the same. The tempter is working through Peter, his selfishness, and his ego. So get behind me, Satan, is the appropriate response. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he gives a powerful, weighty, and very troubling statement. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? Don't you find that statement troubling? Really. Because put it up against the prevailing thought within our society right now. Because the world says, affirm yourself and embrace yourself. And Jesus says, deny yourself. The world says, live your life to the fullest. And Jesus says, take up your cross and live as one who is prepared to die. The world says, be you. Don't follow any path. Make your own way. Be your own boss. And Jesus says, follow me. The world says to really live, do what you want to do. And Jesus says, if you want to save your life and really live, lose your life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel. At every point here, Jesus is confronting our current cultural thought and telling us that the current cultural thought leads to forfeiting life. That's troubling. But it's also true. Because why do you think there's so much societal conflict right now? Why do you think societal conflict has increased at the same time that religious and people have walked away from the church and institutional religion? Why do you think that now in some places, things that would have never been accepted and tolerated are now being allowed? People stealing stuff openly and brazenly without any prosecution? Criminals who commit heinous crimes being released without bail? Allowing people to openly use drugs and then watching those people die from those drugs. And then on a smaller level, but very local, the high school band getting kicked out of the fair parade? Really, these are all symptoms of the values and traditions and customs of our society taking a back seat to the idea of self. It's the elevation of self that is leading to death and deterioration. And the remedy is humility. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Follow me. That's how you stop being a stumbling block. But then here's a problem. You can't just look at somebody and say, be humble. That doesn't work. Humility doesn't come by force. Humility doesn't come by coercion. Humility doesn't come by argument. Humility comes when self-love is replaced by something greater than yourself that you love. And see, that's why the gospel is so crucial in our world. And when I say the gospel, I mean the reason that Jesus said he was going to Jerusalem to suffer, to die, and to be raised. You see, Jesus is going to Jerusalem to die for our sin. And I know that some people don't like talking about sin anymore, but see, hear this. The admitting of our sin and admitting that we don't just make mistakes, but that we are sinners who deserve nothing but punishment of death, that is the ultimate statement of humility. It acknowledges that we're not perfect. It acknowledges that we have failed. It acknowledges that we aren't okay just the way we are. It's an admission that we can't be self-righteous and think that we're better than others. It removes the thought that everyone and everything has to accommodate us because we are broken and in reality don't deserve anything. And yet, despite our brokenness and sinfulness, Jesus takes up his cross to offer himself as payment for our sins. Jesus takes our place on the cross to atone for our inability to be the people that God has created us to be and to live the lives that we were supposed to live. And Jesus' willingness to do this demonstrates his great love for us. For while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And you see, when you come to understand this, it replaces self-love with a greater love. You might say, how? Well, think about it. Think about it. I mean, if you've ever received something you know you didn't deserve, if someone has given you a gift that is far beyond your reach, if someone showed you mercy when you deserved punishment, you know what that does to your heart. You know what that does to your mind. You cast away thoughts of yourself and you live in thankfulness towards the one who showed you love and grace and mercy, especially when you didn't deserve it. You submit your wants and your desires for that other person because you honor what they did for you. And that's the same with Jesus. You know, we no longer live for ourselves, but we live for him. And once we remove ourselves from the front and we start to follow, we realize that doesn't just apply to Jesus, but that applies to a whole lot of other things. We see that in our marriages. Our marriages aren't simply about us and our self-satisfaction and fulfillment. It's about the relationship with our spouse. And if we have children, the kids. Living in a town or community isn't just about my sense of satisfaction and what I get from living there. It's also about learning about that town and its customs and traditions and values and honoring them because I am now a part of that community. Being a part of an organization or church isn't simply about how it cares for me, but it's also about helping to strengthen that organization or church as best as I can. And living in a country isn't about what my country does for me. It's about what I can do for my country. And I want to point out, none of this means that our communities or organizations or even our families are perfect. We're going to leave that fact for another conversation at a later date. But for today, let us recognize that the gospel helps us realize that we are a part of something much bigger than ourselves. And it means that then there are priorities that come into play. There's a pecking order in how we view the importance of things. You see, years ago, I remember reading I Am Third. It's an autobiography by the great Chicago running back, Gale Sayers. How many of you have read that book? Anybody? A few of you have. I know that back when I was in school, it was part of my required classes, I think 4th or 5th grade. And I think it was really influential because my dad repeatedly reinforced the main premise of that book with me as I was growing up. And the main premise of that book is this: the Lord is first, others are second, and I am third. That's the pecking order. And it's no surprise that it lines up with the great commandments that Jesus pointed out. The first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, that love only comes when a heart is changed by the gospel. That love only comes when we humble ourselves and acknowledge our sin and then receive the grace and forgiveness poured out on the cross and in the resurrection. And that means that if we as Christians are concerned about what is going on around us, it's up to us to lead the way as followers, not as stumbling blocks, but as rocks who know who we walk behind, not as affirmers of self, but as deniers of self. And it's not because we think we're better, but it's because we know we're not. And it's because we know the one who died for us, the one who took up his cross, Jesus Christ, the King eternal. May he always lead on. Amen.